of Italian immigrants and Italian Americans in the state as well. And I'm going to be doing a lot of talking. There's not a whole lot of visual stimulation, so if you get tired of me blathering on and on, in the back where my dear mother is, she's holding onto a binder full of artifacts and articles and a ton of photos that I got from a historical society in New Hampshire, as well as one of my interviewees. I just showed up and she gave me all these amazing photos of her family, who are all Italian, articles about her store and everything, so if you want to take a look at that, they're back there. Anytime, just get up and look at them. I'm welcome to. So, let's see. So first off, I looked at Italian immigrants and their descendants, Italian Americans, from the mid-1800s onward, because that's when things really started to pick up in terms of immigration, in terms of people who were coming to the United States, and specifically to New Hampshire. There aren't a whole lot of records, but from what I could find, that was the best date to start. There were Italians coming to New Hampshire earlier, from like the 1600s onward, but they were in very small numbers. They were mostly professionals. That's not really the focus of my thesis. I focus more on the southern Italians, who are the ones who came in such large numbers, in the millions, really. And I was focused on the social history part of it. So their ordinary lives and experiences, things that we would normally take for granted. When I was interviewing them, researching, that's what I was really interested in. Not so much the professional accomplishments, but how they lived, how they assimilated, to what extent they assimilated, their families, that sort of thing. For interviews, out of the dozens of letters and phone calls and emails that I sent out, I had 11 responses, and which ended up being more than enough. And you'll learn a little bit more about them in a few slides. As far as Italians in New Hampshire, there's not a whole lot of research. There's a lot of research on other ethnic groups. As I found out last semester when I researched French Canadians, Latin American Spanish populations, and Italians, when it came time to do Italians, there was a ton in Vermont, a ton in Massachusetts, none in New Hampshire really. Or as I found out, there was some information, but it wasn't organized very well. So I really wanted to contribute something to that pile of research, that scholarly angle, and that's how I did it. That was my angle I was coming from. And not all groups are created equal, as I found. So, limits. There were a lot of limits. First of all, as I said before, I really focused on Southern Italians, Southern Italian families and immigrants, because that's the major population that was coming over from the mid-1800s all the way up through the 1920s. That's when the peak numbers were. Those were the largest amount that were coming over, and that's also my heritage. As a dual Italian-American citizen, my family comes from Palermo, way down in Sicily. So that was also of major interest. As far as the interviewees go, their perspectives aren't necessarily contemporary in terms of when they were talking about their lives growing up. It's from a few decades back, at least. They're all aged 48 and older, so it's not like my generation. This is an older generation talking about what it was like for them back when assimilation was, and immigration was becoming more and more clear-cut. It was a little more obvious. Like, I'm so assimilated now, I mean, I really wouldn't have much to offer in terms of what it's like to be an Italian-American and descendant. I'm third generation, and I wasn't raised with any particular Italian flavor, as it were. But these interviewees really had a clear idea of where their assimilation, their acculturation began, and where it started to blend more into Americanization. Hey, Ro. As far as the gender lines and race, I mean, they all identify as Caucasian, and there's 7 men and 4 women. So in terms of gender perspective, those lines were drawn in the sand a little bit, and this is just how it ended up happening. I cast a very wide net in terms of who I was looking to talk to because I couldn't really find anyone. And the people who responded, this is just how the demographics happened to work out. But I do think these limits made my work a little bit deeper. It really forced me to focus very deeply on one particular group, their particular situations, and look at just a few things and go a little deeper than looking broadly as I had in past semesters. So I think I was able to contribute a little more because of that, because there were so many limits on what I was doing and what I wasn't doing. And of course, as a dual Italian-American citizen, there's not really any, I'm not going to really pretend I'm very objective. Although I will say that, again, I don't really know what it's like to grow up in a household where things are really very much something other than American. So there's that as well. So where's New Hampshire? Within the broader context, it's really wedged between Vermont and Massachusetts in terms of information on Italians and Italian immigration, Italian Americans, because Vermont and Massachusetts, again, have a lot of documentation. But New Hampshire is really focused on either its Irish heritage or French-Canadian heritage. There are whole libraries devoted to French Canadians in particular. But Italians don't get a whole lot of interest, I suppose. There is stuff written about them, as I found, but you really had to dig for it. It wasn't organized in a very accessible way. So, let's see. The United States as a whole was a good starting point. I kind of triangled in. That's where I got a lot of, that's where it was a good springboard for all of the racial stereotypes, the cultural stereotypes, the different gender roles, the language barriers. That gave me a starting point, because there was really nothing to start with New Hampshire in particular. So, and what information there is pretty broad. It's mainly buried in what happened with particular counties and maybe a few particular towns, but it's not focused on particular families really or anything like that. So when did this all happen? I started doing this in July. That's when I started putting together all of the letters with the proposal outline that I mailed or emailed. And I called mainly Italian restaurants. I found there were a lot of authentic Italian restaurants run by actual Italian immigrants in New Hampshire, mainly in the bigger cities like Nashua and Manchester, which are pretty far south. So I called them. I mailed them letters saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what it would be like. These are the limits to what I'm doing. Do you have anyone who might be interested? And I emailed them. I also emailed, I reached out to the historical societies. I was originally going to email all of them, but there are almost 200. So it didn't really get that far. But fortunately, as I did more research, I was able to concentrate on a few towns that I thought, oh, well, they might have some sort of record, some sort of idea of what they have. But most of them emailed me back and said, we have Italians in New Hampshire, so there wasn't a whole lot to offer there, which was disappointing, but it was, I suppose, a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I kind of expected that. And, again, I focused on the mid-1800s onward. I wasn't really finding anything from before that, and I had to set the line somewhere or else I was just going to go out of my mind. So, and I knew from my past research, that's when peak immigration was overall to the U.S. Something like, for Italians in particular, it was about 5 million, 4 million in just 10 years alone. So it worked out pretty well. Now, how did I do this? Let's see. Well, first off, when I wrote to the historical societies, a lot of them would send me back. The ones who did have something offered to send me entire packets. They'd send me emailed documents of things that they'd found in their records, but that were kind of illegible, so they just wrote it up in a document and sent it to me. I also visited the New Hampshire Department of Historical Resources, which I called them, and they didn't think they had anything, so they just pulled a lot of stuff that had to do with quarrying and stonework and all sorts of different towns that they thought might be relevant, where a lot of immigrants were working at the time, not specifically Italian, so I combed through those, and from there I was able to glean some information. I also did a lot of research online, of course. That was really invaluable. Didn't do so much with multimedia, but the photos that I was given were really invaluable. I wasn't expecting that at all. She didn't give any indication that this particular interviewee had any of this, or that she was willing to share them with me, but she gave me a whole binder full of them, which was incredible. And I also, of course, conducted the interviews, which took place between September and November 2012. No, I do this. When I first started researching and doing interviews and that sort of thing back in spring of 2012, the only real feedback I got for my senior proposal, as far as I could tell, was some people wondered why I was going to interview at all, why do any of this, really. And a lot of it's personal. As I said, I recently became a dual Italian-American citizen. I've been one since June 2012. But it's by blood. I've never actually been to the country. It's kind of embarrassing. And I don't speak the language very well. So this was a way to not only contribute to the overall scholarly pool of information that's available about this particular group in a particular state, but I also wanted to learn more about my heritage and where people were coming from, literally and figuratively. It also filled in the gaps that were very obvious when I was doing research back in spring 2012, because the packet on Italians was very long, again, about Vermont and Massachusetts, not so much about New Hampshire. It was maybe a couple pages. So with this, I hope to amend some of that, fill in some of the gaps, and give these local towns a little more perspective, a little more context for this particular immigrant group, which they might not know they had so much information about. And of course, it's a way to preserve the experiences of these particular Italian Americans, Italian immigrants, before they die, because I think the peak age was 85, so between 48 and 85. So this seemed like a good time to start to look into that. And they definitely have a lot to share. Probably because I approached them from the perspective that I was doing this for myself as well as for, a project. I had something invested in it. So I was kind of in a unique position to do that. I felt I had to do something with it. I've lived in New Hampshire basically my whole life. I've always known I was Italian, but now that I have this extra responsibility, I felt like I should be responsible with it. So, again, when I got started, it was really in July. I just cast a very wide net looking for Italian immigrants, Italian Americans who had settled in New Hampshire. That was basically the only requirement, because I didn't know who was going to respond or what I was going to get, if there was even enough of a population to make this worthwhile. So I started early, and by the time I came to Goddard in August, I had a basic idea of how many people were going to be a part of this, were willing to be a part of this. It ended up ending in November, with the last transcript being typed. Yes, by the way, I did not do any of the transcripts that are at the end of the thesis. That was all my mom. She transcribed over 300 pages. So she's been a part of this as well. Yes.
Can't take a whole lot of credit.
But I would still be there if she hadn't graciously agreed to do that. So that was a big thing. And it also gave me a lot of time to draft, really modify a consent form, because I'd interviewed people back in spring 2012, so I had that to work with. Setting up times, because they were all over the state, mostly in the southern part of New Hampshire, but still all over the state, and you have to drive to get everywhere, so we had to set that up. And deal with the travel, deal with drafting questions specific to each interviewee, because I didn't just start out with one blanket set of questions, because they all ended up being very different, and I had to be responsive to that. That was part of the technique I chose. And, of course, contacting all the historical societies, which took a great deal of time. I was still getting replies at the end of November from people who mostly said we don't have anything. But that took a while as well, because the ones who did respond needed time, and in some cases money, to compile packages to send to me. So if you're going to do anything like this, I do recommend you get started before you think you need to, because you'll end up using all of the time, trust me. And the Division of Historical Resources ended up being extremely helpful, although they didn't think they had anything. I didn't really focus too much on other immigrant groups. That was part of the limits I imposed on this project, but they did provide a good context for past research that I'd done in the spring, what Italian immigrants' experiences were like compared to other immigrant groups. The most comparable one I found was the French Canadians, who are